What does it truly take to shatter a lifetime of belief? For many, faith is not a casual affiliation, but the very bedrock of their identity. So what happens when that bedrock crumbles? What happens when a person, sometimes one who has dedicated their entire life and career to God, comes to the sober conclusion that it's all a mirage? This video tells the powerful and deeply personal stories of well-known figures, from celebrated artists to respected clergy, who walked away from their faith. We won't just list names, we will explore their intimate journeys, the intellectual crossroads they faced, the emotional toll of their deconstruction, and the specific arguments that ultimately led them to a life without God. These are compelling testimonies from behind the curtain of belief. This process of deconversion is deeply personal, and the social fallout varies wildly across the globe. We want this channel to be a home for those who've walked similar paths. Let us know where you're watching from, and tell us a bit about how leaving a faith is viewed in your culture. Is it spoken of openly, or is it a hidden journey? Please like and subscribe to join our growing community. The preacher who lost his pulpit. Imagine a young man, a prodigy of faith. By the age of 15, he's already a traveling evangelist, a firebrand for the faith, his piano-playing fingers dancing across the keys as he composes Christian musicals that will be performed in churches across the nation. This was Dan Barker. He wasn't a casual believer, he was an architect of belief in others. His life was a testament to the power of Jesus. He was a missionary in Mexico, a popular preacher, a man who could hold a congregation in the palm of his hand, his voice ringing with the certainty of salvation. He had a loving, equally devout wife and a clear divine purpose. From the outside, his faith was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute. But a fortress, no matter how strong, can be brought down from the inside. For Dan, the first cracks in the stained glass appeared not as a thunderclap of doubt, but as a slow, creeping accumulation of intellectual inconsistencies. As a preacher, he was expected to have the answers, and for years he did. He had pat answers for the problem of evil, for the apparent contradictions in the Bible, for the sheer injustice of an eternal hell, for a finite lifetime of disbelief. He had learned the art of apologetics, the intellectual acrobatics required to make the unbelievable seem plausible. He could explain away the talking snake, the global flood, the sun standing still in the sky. Yet, late at night, when the applause of the congregation had faded, the questions he so cleverly dismissed for others began to gnaw at him. He began to read, not just the Bible, which he knew intimately, but philosophy, science, history. He encountered thinkers who didn't start with the conclusion that God was real and work backwards. He read about evolution, not as the satanic lie he'd been taught it was, but as a breathtakingly elegant explanation for the diversity of life. He learned about the history of his own holy book, about its compilation by human committees, its edits, its political motivations. He learned about other religions, other mythologies, and began to see unsettling parallels. The virgin births, the dying and rising gods, the flood myths, was his faith, which he believed to be utterly unique, just another variation on a very old human theme. The process was not quick. It was a 5-year-long, agonizing intellectual war waged within the confines of his own mind. Every new piece of information that contradicted his faith was a blow. He would spend weeks trying to reconcile it, to find a way to fit the square peg of reason into the round hole of dogma. He described it as a slow, painful process of subtraction. God wasn't suddenly gone, he just got smaller and smaller. The all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving deity of his sermons began to shrink, eroded by logic and evidence until all that was left was nothing. The final straw wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. He looked at the doctrine of hell, a concept he had preached about, and he finally saw it for what it was. A celestial torture chamber of infinite cruelty, conceived by a being supposedly defined by infinite love. It was a monstrous contradiction. He realized he could no longer, in good conscience, worship such a being. He was, by his own moral compass, a better person than the God he was supposed to adore. Leaving his faith wasn't a choice he made lightly. It meant losing everything. His career, his community, his identity, and very nearly his marriage. The confession to his wife was a moment of supreme terror, but it was also a moment of supreme liberation. When he finally stepped away from the pulpit and declared himself an atheist, he wasn't embracing emptiness. He was embracing reality. Today, as the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker hasn't stopped preaching. He just has a new gospel, one of reason, secularism, and the freedom of the human mind. His journey is a powerful testament that sometimes the most devout shepherd can come to realize the flock is being led astray. The Penitent Scholar. Some people lose their faith in a fiery sermon or a moment of personal tragedy. Bart D. Ehrman lost his in the quiet, dusty archives of ancient manuscripts. His story is not one of rebellion, but of meticulous, painstaking scholarship that ultimately dismantled the very foundation of his belief. Ehrman was not just a believer, he was a warrior for the Word. As a young man, he was a zealous born-again Christian, attending the highly conservative Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College, institutions where the Bible is held to be the perfect, inerrant, divinely inspired Word of God. His life's mission was clear: to master the original biblical languages, Greek and Hebrew, so he could defend the Scriptures against any and all critics. He was training to be a champion of orthodoxy. His quest for academic perfection led him to a PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. It was here in the hallowed halls of advanced biblical studies that his faith began to unravel, not because of some liberal professor or secular philosophy, but because of the very texts he had sworn to defend. Ehrman's specialty is textual criticism, the science of reconstructing the original biblical texts from the thousands of ancient manuscript copies that have survived. These copies, penned by scribes over centuries, are not identical. In fact, they are riddled with differences, tens of thousands of them. Some are simple spelling errors, but many are significant, altering key passages about the nature of Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, or the path to salvation. Imagine dedicating your life to proving the perfection of a single, divine blueprint, only to discover that you don't have the blueprint. All you have are countless conflicting copies of copies of copies, and you have no certain way of knowing what the original even said. For Ehrman, this was a slow intellectual corrosion. He realized that the Word of God he held in his hands was the product of a long, messy, and entirely human process of transmission, copying, and, crucially, alteration. Scribes, either accidentally or deliberately, changed the text to suit their own theological leanings. How could this be the inerrant Word of God if it was so demonstrably fallible and fluid? This realization didn't make him an atheist overnight. His faith evolved. He moved from being a fundamentalist who believed in biblical inerrancy to a more liberal Christian who accepted that the Bible was a human book that still contained divine truths. He could still believe in God and Jesus, even if the Bible wasn't a perfect historical or scientific document. He held on to this more progressive form of faith for many years. But while his intellect chipped away at the book, his heart was being chipped away at by the world. The final and perhaps most profound blow to his faith was not textual but philosophical: the problem of suffering. As a scholar and as a human being, he could not reconcile the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God with the brutal reality of tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands, children dying of cancer, and the endless, pointless suffering that permeates existence. The apologetic answers he once found comforting now sounded hollow and cruel. The idea that suffering is part of God's mysterious plan, or a test of faith, or a punishment for sin, became morally repugnant to him. It was an answer that exonerated the Creator at the expense of the creation. He concluded that he could believe in a God who was all-powerful but not all-loving, a cosmic tyrant. Or he could believe in a God who was all-loving but not all-powerful, a well-meaning but impotent deity. But the God of traditional Christianity, both all-loving and all-powerful, simply could not coexist with the world he saw around him. The intellectual doubts about the Bible, combined with this overwhelming moral and emotional problem of suffering, finally led him to let go. He transitioned from liberal Christian to agnostic, and eventually to an agnostic atheist. Today, Bart Ehrman is one of the world's most renowned and respected New Testament scholars, and also one of its most prominent critics from a secular perspective. His journey is a chilling lesson for the faithful. He didn't stop believing because he stopped reading the Bible. He stopped believing because he read it more closely than almost anyone else on earth. The Unbelieving Saint. This next story is different. It is unsettling, complex, and challenges our very definitions of faith and doubt. It is not the story of a public deconversion, but of a private 50-year-long spiritual abyss endured by one of the 20th century's most iconic religious figures. We're talking about Mother Teresa of Calcutta, a woman whose name became synonymous with unshakable faith and divine compassion, a living saint in the eyes of millions. Her public image was of a woman so intimately connected with God that she could see his face in the poorest of the poor, feel his love in every act of service. But behind the serene public smile, a very different reality was unfolding. It was a reality of profound, unrelenting darkness. This was revealed to the world after her death, with the publication of her private letters and diaries in a book titled, "Come Be My Light." The contents are staggering. They reveal that for the last 5 decades of her life, from roughly the time she began her work in the slums of Calcutta until her death, Mother Teresa felt a complete and total absence of God. Let me read you some of her own words. To one spiritual advisor, she wrote, "The silence and the emptiness is so great that I look and do not see, listen and do not hear." She described her experience of God as the darkness, the terrible emptiness, the pain of longing. In another letter, she confessed, "In my soul I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing." Let that sink in. The woman held up as the ultimate exemplar of Christian faith wrote, in her own private torment, of the feeling that God might not really exist. This was not a temporary dark night of the soul, a concept well known in Christian mysticism where a believer feels distant from God for a time as a test of faith. This was her permanent state of being for half a century. Her smile, as she later described it, was a mask, a cloak that covered her inner desolation. She was a performer of faith, going through the motions of prayer and devotion, while feeling absolutely nothing in return. She wrote of feeling like a hypocrite, speaking of God's love to others when she, herself, felt only his deafening silence. So, what do we make of this? Was Mother Teresa a secret atheist? No, that would be too simple. The letters also show her desperately clinging to the idea of God, continuing her work not because of a felt divine presence, but in a kind of blind, desperate obedience to a God she could no longer feel, hear, or sense in any way. Her story occupies a strange liminal space between faith and unbelief. She lived day in and day out in the very heart of the God mirage. She experienced what many atheists suspect is the truth of religious experience, that when you call out into the cosmic void, the only thing that answers is the echo of your own voice. Her case is profoundly troubling for believers. If this woman, who sacrificed everything in the name of God, could not feel his presence, what hope is there for the average person in the pews? Her life could be interpreted in 2 ways. For the faithful, it's a story of the ultimate test of faith, to keep serving a God who gives you nothing back. But for the skeptic, it is a heartbreaking tragedy. It's the story of a woman who, based on one powerful spiritual experience early in her life, dedicated the next 50 years to chasing a feeling that never returned, living in a state of profound spiritual loneliness while the world celebrated her for a connection she had long since lost. It suggests that perhaps the most fervent expressions of faith are not born from certainty, but from a desperate attempt to conquer an all-encompassing doubt. The comic and the cosmos. Not all deconversion stories are born from the dusty depths of theological archives or the dark nights of the soul. Sometimes they start with a simple knock at the door. For the comedian and actress Julia Sweeney, best known for her time on Saturday Night Live, the journey away from her Catholic upbringing began with 2 earnest, clean-cut Mormon missionaries. She let them in, and being a curious and open-minded person, she decided to genuinely engage with them. Their visit sparked a question in her mind. What did she actually believe? She realized she'd been coasting on a kind of cultural Catholicism, a faith of habit rather than a faith of conviction. So she decided to do something radical. She decided to read the Bible, all of it, cover to cover. Not as a sacred text to be revered, but as a book to be understood. She chronicled this journey in her brilliant and hilarious one-woman show, Letting Go of God. What she found in the pages of the Old and New Testaments was not a coherent story of divine love, but a bizarre, often contradictory, and frankly, morally horrifying collection of ancient texts. She read about the God who demands Abraham kill his own son, a God who drowns the entire world save for one family, a God who meticulously details laws for slavery. The more she read, the less divine it all seemed. Her journey was one of sincere, almost childlike questioning. She would read a passage and think, wait, really? She'd go to a priest with her questions, only to be met with unsatisfying allegorical interpretations and calls to simply have faith. But for a logical mind, just have faith is not an answer. It's a dismissal of the question. She couldn't unsee the contradictions. She couldn't unread the passages that depicted a God who was jealous, petty, and violent. The God of the Bible was not the benevolent, loving Father she had been taught about in Sunday school. He was a character in a book, and not a very pleasant one. As her biblical faith crumbled, she explored other spiritual paths. She tried meditation, explored Buddhism, seeking a spiritual connection that made sense. But the real turning point, the thing that filled the void left by her disintegrating faith, was not another religion. It was science. Someone gave her a copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and it opened up a universe of genuine wonder. Here was a story far grander, far more elegant, and far more beautiful than any creation myth. The story of stellar nucleosynthesis, the fact that the calcium in our bones and the iron in our blood were forged in the heart of an exploding star billions of years ago, was more awe-inspiring than the story of Adam being fashioned from dust. The immensity of geologic time and the intricate, unguided dance of evolution were more profound than a six-day creation. Julia Sweeney's story is so compelling because it is so relatable. It's the story of someone who took their childhood religion seriously as an adult and found it couldn't withstand the scrutiny. Her deconversion wasn't angry or bitter. It was a gentle, often funny process of intellectual discovery. She simply followed the evidence where it led, and it led her away from dogma and towards a naturalistic worldview filled with its own sense of awe and connection. Her experience raises a fascinating question for anyone who has walked a similar path. What was the first domino to fall for you? Was it a single verse in a holy book that just didn't sit right? A scientific fact that contradicted scripture, or maybe a personal moment of clarity when the whole structure just seemed absurd? Share that aha or uh-oh moment in the comments. For Julia Sweeney, it started with a knock on the door and ended with her looking up at the stars, not with prayer, but with understanding. The Troubadour of Doubt. In the world of contemporary Christian music, or CCM, faith isn't just a personal belief, it's a product. It's packaged into 3.5-minute anthems, sold in arenas, and marketed to a demographic hungry for reassurance. And for years, Derek Webb was one of its most celebrated craftsmen. As a founding member of the highly successful band Caedmon's Call, Webb wrote and sang songs that were the soundtrack to an entire generation of evangelical youth group kids. He had the career, the acclaim, and the platform. He was, by all accounts, a success story of modern American Christianity. But Derek Webb had a problem. He was an honest man, and his honesty led him to start pulling at the threads of the very tapestry he was helping to weave. His journey out of faith wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, methodical deconstruction, a process he was brave or foolish enough to document in his music. He began to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about church hypocrisy, about the marriage of American politics with evangelical faith, about doctrines that seemed more man-made than God-breathed. His 2003 solo album, She Must and Shall Go Free, was the first tremor. It was a critique of the church, but a loving one from the inside. Many fans embraced it, but he kept pulling at the threads. His album, The Great War, delved into the messy, complicated realities of marriage and lust, topics the sanitized world of CCM preferred to keep under the rug. Then came Stockholm Syndrome, an album so theologically provocative that his own Christian record label refused to release it. The title track compares the relationship between some believers and God to that of a hostage and their captor, a love born of fear and dependence. He was directly challenging the very nature of divine love and free will. The industry that had built him up now saw him as a liability, a heretic with a guitar. What drove this deconstruction? It was, in his own words, a commitment to intellectual integrity. He couldn't reconcile the Jesus of the Gospels, the radical, poor, anti-establishment figure who hung out with outcasts, with the polished, wealthy, politically powerful entity of the modern American church. He couldn't reconcile a God of love with doctrines of eternal torment. He couldn't pretend to have certainty about ancient texts filled with ambiguity and contradiction. He followed the path of doubt wherever it led, even when it cost him his audience, his record deal, and his identity within the community that had been his entire world. Eventually, the deconstruction led him all the way out the door. In 2020, he publicly stated that he could no longer identify as a Christian. The endpoint of his relentless questioning was the realization that he no longer believed in the foundational claims of the faith. His journey is a fascinating case study in what happens when an artist prizes intellectual honesty above commercial success and communal acceptance. He wasn't cast out for losing his faith. He was cast out for daring to question it out loud. Derek Webb's story shows that sometimes the biggest threat to a religious institution isn't an external enemy, but an internal voice that simply asks, "Is this really true?" The Reluctant Revolutionary. Long before he became a figure of controversy, a man whose very name would launch a century-and-a-half-long culture war, he was just a quiet, unassuming naturalist with a simple plan: to become a country parson. Charles Darwin, the man who would dismantle the biblical account of creation, was a student of theology at Christ College, Cambridge. He didn't question the literal truth of the Bible. The life of a clergyman, he thought, would be ideal, affording him ample time to indulge his passion for collecting beetles and studying the natural world, which he saw as a perfect reflection of God's handiwork. His faith was the conventional, comfortable faith of his time and class. It was a clockwork universe wound up by a divine creator, ticking along according to his perfect laws. And then he boarded a ship called the Beagle. The 5-year voyage that followed would change the course of human thought forever. As he meticulously cataloged the flora and fauna of distant lands, particularly the Galapagos Islands, he began to see things that the Book of Genesis could not explain. He saw tortoises with different shells on each island, finches with beaks perfectly adapted to their specific food sources. It did not look like the work of a designer who created each animal for a fixed purpose. It looked like a world in constant, brutal, competitive flux. It looked like transmutation. The seeds of doubt were planted, but his faith did not die on the Beagle. It died a much slower, more painful death back home, in the quiet of his study and the grief of his heart. As he formulated his theory of evolution by natural selection, he was wrestling with its profound theological implications. The theory didn't just challenge the 6-day creation story, it challenged the very idea of a benevolent design. Natural selection was a wasteful, cruel, and haphazard process. For every beautifully adapted creature, there were thousands that had perished. He saw a parasitic wasp that laid its eggs inside a living caterpillar, its larvae eating the host from the inside out. "I cannot persuade myself," he wrote, "that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." This was the problem of suffering, not in the abstract, but written into the very fabric of nature. The Book of Nature did not speak of a loving father. It spoke of a blind, indifferent struggle for existence. This intellectual earthquake was compounded by a devastating personal tragedy: the death of his beloved 10-year-old daughter Annie in 1851. Her slow, agonizing death from what was likely tuberculosis shattered any remaining vestiges of his faith in a just and merciful God. What divine plan could possibly be served by the pointless suffering of an innocent child? The platitudes of religion offered no comfort, only hollow words in the face of such raw, visceral pain. Darwin lost his faith not with a bang, but with a long, melancholic sigh. He slowly transitioned from a Christian to a deist who believed in a distant creator, and finally, to an agnostic. He never became a crusading atheist. He was too gentle a man for that. But he had seen too much. He had seen the brutal mechanics of life and the unfeeling cruelty of death. For the man who had set out to be a priest studying nature, the study of nature had made being a priest impossible. The God he once saw in every perfect flower and intricate insect had dissolved, replaced by the grand, terrifying, and impersonal reality of evolution. The Author of Heresy. There are two great narratives in Western culture, the author Philip Pullman has said. One is the story of the fall from Genesis. The other is the story of the fall of the rebel angels from Milton's Paradise Lost. For most of Christian history, we have been told to side with God, the victor. But Pullman, one of the most brilliant and audacious storytellers of our time, decided to take the side of the rebels. Raised in the Anglican tradition, the grandson of a clergyman, Pullman grew up steeped in the stories and language of the King James Bible and the poetry of John Milton. But unlike his contemporary, C.S. Lewis, who saw in these stories a profound truth that led him to faith, Pullman saw something very different. He saw a story of tyranny. He saw, in the God of Paradise Lost, a totalitarian monarch who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. And in Satan, a tragic hero fighting for freedom of thought and self-determination. This radical rereading of the foundational myths of his culture became the engine of his life's work. His deconversion was not a quiet private affair. It was an act of literary rebellion on an epic scale. He didn't just walk away from the church. He set out to build a rival cosmology, a new mythology for a secular humanistic age. That new mythology is his magnificent trilogy, his Dark Materials. The books are a direct, deliberate, and devastating inversion of Christian theology and narratives like Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. In Narnia, children walk through a wardrobe into a world ruled by a divine lion who demands faith and sacrifice. In Pullman's multiverse, children travel between worlds to wage war against a senile, impotent, and tyrannical deity known only as the Authority. The church in his books is a sinister global organization called the Magisterium, dedicated to suppressing knowledge, controlling thought, and committing acts of breathtaking cruelty in the name of God. Original sin isn't a stain to be washed away. It is the glorious moment of awakening to consciousness, knowledge, and sexuality. A moment to be celebrated, not repented. Pullman describes himself not as an atheist, but as an agnostic atheist, or more simply, a post-Christian. His issue isn't so much with the existence of God, but with the entire moral and intellectual framework that monotheistic religion has imposed upon the world. He sees it as a system that infantilizes humanity, praises ignorance as innocence, demands obedience to authority over independent thought, and denigrates the joys of the physical world in favor of a supposed reward in a non-existent afterlife. His work is a passionate argument for a republic of heaven, a world where meaning is not handed down from on high, but is built here on earth by human hands, through love, knowledge, wisdom, and kindness. He didn't lose his faith because of a scientific argument or a personal tragedy. He lost it because he was a storyteller who looked at the greatest story his culture had to offer and decided that the villain was the hero and the hero was the villain. He chose a different story, one not of sin and salvation, but of dust and starlight, of rebellion, and the fierce, beautiful, and difficult task of being human. The Heretic of the Horn. The stories we've explored so far have largely been journeys of intellectual and philosophical disentanglement from Western Christian traditions. But the chains of faith can be forged in any culture, and sometimes they are not just intellectual constructs, but instruments of brutal physical and psychological control. No story illustrates this more powerfully than that of Hirsi Ali. Born in Somalia into a devout Muslim clan, Her early life was defined by the strictures and certainties of Islam. She wore the hijab, she studied the Quran, she prayed 5 times a day. She endured female genital mutilation as a young girl, a practice justified and perpetuated by cultural and religious tradition. Her faith was not a gentle Sunday morning affair. It was an all-encompassing reality that dictated her dress, her thoughts, her future, and her value as a human being. For a time, she was a true believer, even becoming attracted to the radical, politicized Islam of the Muslim Brotherhood. She saw the West as decadent and corrupt, and Islam as the only path to purity and justice. But beneath the surface of her devotion, a critical mind was stirring. Living in Saudi Arabia and Kenya, she saw firsthand the profound subjugation of women, justified at every turn by religious law. She saw the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the suppression of any and all dissent. The turning point came when her father arranged her marriage to a distant cousin in Canada. For her, this was a death sentence, not a physical death, but the death of herself. Facing a life of servitude to a man she did not know, she made a choice that was an act of profound heresy. She fled. On a layover in Germany, she escaped, seeking political asylum in the Netherlands. It was there that her real education and her de-apostasy began. In the freedom of Europe, she devoured the books she had been forbidden to read. She read secular philosophers, feminist writers, and atheist thinkers. She read Spinoza, Freud, and John Stuart Mill. She discovered a world of ideas that placed human reason, individual liberty, and universal rights above divine revelation and tribal authority. She began to re-examine the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, not with the eyes of a believer, but with the critical lens of a modern, educated woman. And what she saw horrified her. She saw not a religion of peace, but a blueprint for a theocratic society where women are property, where unbelievers are to be fought, and where critical thought is a crime against God. Her loss of faith was not a gentle drift. It was a violent, liberating rupture. It was the realization that the God she had been taught to worship was the architect of her own oppression. To abandon her faith was an act of intellectual liberation, but more than that, it was an act of survival. Ayaan Hirsi Ali did not just quietly leave her faith. She became one of its most vocal and controversial critics. As a member of the Dutch parliament and later as a writer and activist, she began to speak the unspeakable, criticizing Islam from a place of deep, personal experience. Her journey cost her dearly. She has lived under constant death threats, was forced into hiding, and watched her friend and collaborator, the filmmaker Theo van Gogh, get murdered on the streets of Amsterdam for their film Submission, which criticized the treatment of women in Islam. Her story is a stark and vital reminder that for many people around the world, deconversion is not an intellectual exercise. It is a life-or-death struggle for the freedom to think, to speak, and to live. Conclusion: the preacher who could no longer worship a cruel God, the scholar whose meticulous research revealed a human book, the saint who felt only a divine silence, the comedian who found more wonder in science than in scripture, the musician who prized honesty over a career, the naturalist who saw the brutal truth of existence, the novelist who rewrote the myths, and the survivor who escaped a divine cage. These are not stories of people who were lazy or sinful or tempted by a secular world. They are the stories of courageous and thoughtful individuals who looked at the faith they were given, examined it with intellectual rigor and moral clarity, and found it wanting. They show us that the path away from God is often paved with the very virtues religion claims to champion: a love of truth, a passion for justice, and a deep and abiding compassion for humanity. They chose the uncertainty of reason over the comfort of dogma. They chose the terrifying freedom of a world without a script. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the God Mirage. If these stories resonated with you, please hit that like button to help them reach more people who might be wrestling with these same questions. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into faith, doubt, and the human search for meaning. And be sure to click that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We would love to hear your biggest takeaway from these powerful testimonies in the comments below. Was it the intellectual honesty, the moral courage, or something else entirely that struck you the most? Thank you for watching.